unintentional second-degree murder, third-degree murder, second-degree manslaughter, and guilty, guilty, guilty.
A murder verdict in the George Floyd death trial and relief on the streets of Minneapolis. But does this signal a new era of racial justice and police reform in the United States? Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. The death of African American George Floyd in Minneapolis last year after a white police officer knelt on his back and neck for over 9 minutes is now officially murder. Former police officer Derek Chauvin was found guilty of second and third degree murder as well as second degree manslaughter on Tuesday. He faces a sentence that could send him to prison for the rest of his life. The verdict brought relief to the people outside the courtroom and to many across America who've been calling for police reform and racial justice. George Floyd's brother hopes the verdict will even have an impact beyond the United States.
I get calls, I get DMs, people from Brazil, from Ghana, from Germany, everybody, London, Italy, they're all saying the same thing. We won't be able to breathe until you're able to breathe. Today, we are able to breathe again.
Before we get to our panel, let's go first to CGTN correspondent Dan Williams. He's been in Minneapolis for some time. Dan, what is the mood there one day after this verdict?
Yeah, there's a real sense of calm here now, a city beginning to get back to some kind of sense of normalcy. I'm here at George Floyd Square. As you can see, people coming here, laying flowers, paying their respects to George Floyd. The Minnesota governor, Tim Walz, has announced that the process of withdrawing the National Guard will begin and the boarding around some of the downtown area starting to come down as this city breathes a sigh of relief that there were very few incidences, if any, following the verdicts yesterday. Derek Chauvin, well, he has begun and enjoying his first full day back in prison for the first time since October. He was out on bail since then, the judge revoking that following those guilty verdicts. A new mug shot has also been released from the prison where he is staying now at Oak Park Heights Maximum Security Prison. He's under administrative segregation for his own safety. But this, of course, is not the end of the matter. The sentencing will take place around 8 weeks from now. And of course, there's also the trials of the other 3 officers that were involved here at this spot. For the Floyd family, well, they spoke of their relief. We heard that there, and also their determination to make this a point of change as well. I was speaking a little earlier today to Angela Harrelson. She's George Floyd's aunt. She talked about her relief as well, saying it's a verdict is a validation to black and brown people in the country, and also saying particular praise for Darnella Fraser. Now, she was the then 17-year-old who took the video footage from that spot over there, and she says that without that video footage, there would not have been a trial and there would not have been justice.
Well, the U.S. Attorney General has announced an investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department. Now, what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the Attorney General Merrick Garland earlier announcing that the U.S. Department of Justice would launch this federal investigation into the Minneapolis police practices, saying that the verdict itself obviously would not address some of the root cause issues that this trial has raised, saying that this will look at policies around training, around use of force, and will report back if anything is discovered. But a little earlier, I was also speaking to Tashira Garraway. Now, she is part of a group called Family Supporting Families Against Police Brutality, and she was saying that although she welcomes this step, she wants that this investigation to be widened to some of the other police departments in Minnesota, and also saying that there are a number of other cases of families that she knows of where she wants those cases reopened, and saying that if authorities had listened to them over the last couple of decades, then George Floyd would not have happened.
Dan Williams for us in Minneapolis. Thanks so much. Well, there is so much to discuss on this story, so let's get right to it. Joining us now in Washington, D.C. is Talisa Carter. She's an assistant professor with the Department of Justice, Law, and Criminology at American University. Joining us, too, from Maryland is Rashawn Ray. He is a fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. With us, too, from Los Angeles is Cheryl Dorsey. She's a retired sergeant with the L.A. Police Department, a 20-year veteran there. And she's also the author of Black and Blue. And also joining us is Joseph Williams. He's senior news editor for U.S. News and World Report. Welcome, all of you, to the broadcast. Joseph, why don't I start with you? Lots of reactions yesterday. We saw tears of joy, hugs, jubilation outside the courthouse in Minneapolis. And civil rights attorney Ben Crump believes this verdict could actually be a turning point. Let's listen to what he had to say.
America, let this be the precedent. Yes. Let this be the precedent where we live up to the high ideals and the promises when we say liberty and justice for all.
Pretty powerful words. Can this be a precedent?
Well, one would hope so, but the evidence kind of pushes back against that, because consider, before the verdict was announced in the Chauvin case, police killed a youngster in, I believe, Ohio. And after today, there was another killing in Wilmington, North Carolina. Police shot a man during execution of a search warrant. Now, we don't know all the facts about either of those two cases, but we do know that the beat kind of goes on here, where police are using force against African Americans, and it doesn't ever seem to stop. And even though the Floyd verdict was one that, the Chauvin verdict was one that was very much anticipated, was very highly regarded, and could be one of the most highly publicized convictions of a police officer using deadly force against an African American, consider the fact that unless we had a videotape, we would not have heard about this at all. In fact, the Minneapolis Police Department had issued initial reports saying that Floyd had died of a medical condition, that it was a medical condition, that it was aggravated by the arrest. So there were a lot of factors that came together to make this case one that everyone watched, and one that was all but certain to end up in guilt for many of the casual observers. But those of us who have watched these things time and time and time again understand that even though you had such powerful evidence, including the police chief testifying against one of his own officers, this case was almost an anomaly. Now, it could be a turning point. It could be sending a signal to a lot of officers that use of force has to be more tightly regulated. And indeed, in some of the last recent shootings that we've seen, officers have given aid to the victims that they have shot. But the shooting still continues. The police actions against people still continue. And it's going to take a lot for reform to actually happen and stick.
Shootings continue, Cheryl, and to that point, I was looking at the statistics. They're very alarming. The U.S., as far as civilians being shot by police, more than any other wealthy country. The statistics, U.S. police killing an estimated 7,638 between 2013 to 2019. The closest country would be Canada. They only had 224 deaths. You look at Norway, Finland, it's been years and years and years before they've seen these types of police killings. Yet case after case here in the United States, to Joseph's point, it seems like officers sometimes aren't prosecuted, and when they are, they walk. So explain to us why this huge margin, why are there more shootings here in the United States, and why is it so many of these cases, as Joseph points out, the officers themselves walk out of the courtroom a free man?
Well, I think everything has to do with accountability. If you don't do anything to deter bad behavior, why would a police officer do anything differently? And we've seen that play out since May 2020, when Mr. Floyd was first murdered in front of us. We've seen officers use excessive use of force on protesters between that time. Even as the verdict was being read, there was a deadly use of force. We heard a 26-year veteran police officer try to convince us somehow she doesn't know the difference between her duty weapon and her taser. And so, but for Derek Chauvin having murdered Mr. Floyd, he was well on his way to racking up another personnel complaint. After all, we now know that there were 22 personnel complaints leveled against him. He had only been disciplined once. It's not like that department didn't know who he was. He had already been a raging forest fire. They refused to extinguish him until he extinguished Mr. Floyd.
And Rashawn, you've written about this. Bad apples come from rotten trees in policing, and you've even gotten more granular when it comes to the numbers. If you're a black individual, your chances of being shot by the police dramatically higher, especially if you're a black teenager, right?
I mean, that's exactly right. Look, black people are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police when we're not attacking, nor when we have a weapon. When it comes to black teenagers are 21 times more likely than white teenagers to be killed by police, like we saw in Ohio. And we have to be clear that really what we're talking about is a racial gap that is driven by racial bias. And we have to be very clear about what is happening here, whether it's implicit or explicit. It plays out, and it plays out in stereotypes about black people's bodies, that even when we're unarmed, even when we're not attacking, we see these same incidents. And low-level offenses like an air freshener or tinted windows or a broken taillight are oftentimes used as justification for racial profiling to pull us over, search us disproportionately, and then unfortunately, a lot of these incidents end up being use of force incidents, either police killings or what I call trickle-down policing, the sort of things that we're talking about that don't always end up on a headline, but can end up in a civil settlement where taxpayers are paying out millions of dollars and billions oftentimes each year in civilian settlements for police misconduct.
Rashawn, in your piece, you wrote, as I turned 40, I had the realization that I've been stopped by police more times than my age. I think that that's a shocking piece of information. And you can understand in so many of these incidents, you see the frustration of these young black men. Why are you pulling me over? Why are you hassling me? This is kind of a part of their life, isn't it?
Unfortunately, it's true. Look, we cannot outclass racism. Whether we're professors like myself and Professor Carter, police officers, journalists, it doesn't matter, right? Whether or not I don't have a criminal record oftentimes doesn't impact the fact that my blackness becomes weaponized when I interact with law enforcement. Whether, again, we want to call it fear, implicit bias, or explicit bias, the outcome oftentimes becomes the same. And people are sick and tired of being sick and tired because in America, we're told to pull ourselves up from our bootstraps, to do what we're supposed to do, go to school, stay out of trouble. But race in America, and racism specifically, continues to be the genetic birth defect of the United States that we can't seem to get past.
Talisa, the U.S. president has said these mass shootings are an embarrassment to the United States, but talk to us about how this tarnishes the U.S. image globally as well. I mean, these police shootings are happening. They're all too common.
Yeah, absolutely. So police shootings across the country in the United States, I mean, it can't be good for our reputation. Right? The amount of guns, the gun rate, the process to which people can get access to guns, the vetting process, police culture, these things have been on the top of conversations in the United States for decades now. And so when we talk about global or international embarrassment, the conversation really has to be about what are we going to do about it? And so it's one thing that I think we've acknowledged that problem. It's established. It's almost anecdotal. It's conversational at times. The constant repetition of these incidents on the news, some people are even considering themselves numb to it. People this week, for weeks, for months, have avoided watching broadcasts such as this one, right? Because it's trauma. But what are we going to do about it? And so I think it's one thing to acknowledge the United States in this context as a place of shame, national shame, international embarrassment. But the conversation needs to shift to what actions are we going to take on the global forum, because people are watching, trying to figure out what are we going to do.
Well, and you talked about the global forum. This is an interesting case in that we saw protests here in the United States, but they spilled over around the world. Why do you think the case resonated far and wide as it did, Talisa?
Yeah, so racism itself is not singular to the United States. The issue of Black and brown bodies in terms of resource distribution, access to equitable rights in various settings, that's not particularly to the United States. I think the U.S. history is unique, right? Policing culture, the history of the police in the United States is unique, but it's not singular. And so across the globe, Black and brown people can not only emphasize, but there's an alignment, there's a sense of unity. And that's why Black Lives Matter is a global phenomenon, a global movement. And even beyond race, right, just going into color, right? Colorism is pervasive. That's international context. So because people are living this experience beyond outside of the United States, that's why these conversations, these movements will continue to happen. Additionally, technology. And so these videos that we see, unfortunately, of Black death, Black trauma, right, abuse of force by law enforcement officials, again, it's not just happening in one place. There's a global effect, and we really have to think about the ramifications of that.
Joseph, the Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison said after the verdict that this is not justice, it is accountability, which is the first step towards justice. And he applauded the 12 jurors, but he said now it's kind of in our hands, the rest of society, to take this up and do something about it. And Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer had something to say about that today. Let's listen to what he had to say, and I want to get your reaction on the other side.
This goes way beyond party or political faction. Racism strikes at the very core of this country. Justice, true justice, will not come until we finally banish the ancient poison of racism from the American soul. The Senate will continue to work as we strive to ensure that George Floyd's tragic death will not be in vain. We will not rest until the Senate passes strong legislation to end the systemic bias in law enforcement.
So, Joseph, you can get 12 jurors to agree this was wrong, but what about getting the senators to actually take action?
Well, good luck with that. I mean, one of the, pardon me for being so cynical, but this bill has been lingering around for months and for a long, long time, ever since George Floyd's name became a national cause célèbre. And I would be more optimistic if we didn't have such intransigence on the right to any kind of reform that they believe might harm police. They believe that officers are venerated, they put their lives on the line, which is true in a large context, and many, many officers do their jobs honorably and responsibly and don't end up in prison because they killed somebody by kneeling on them for 9 minutes. However, I would argue that there is a through line between mass shootings and what we see here between over-policing of minority communities, use of force incidents against African Americans. I mean, a quick side note, I don't know of any friend of mine, a black male friend of mine, we all have stories. I myself, I don't have 40, I have 3 times where I've stopped by the police and where I might have been there for a couple of inches or a few moments here and there. I might have been a George Floyd of our time. But my main point is that we've got a whole culture, conservative typically, but not always, that venerates police. Every year we have a law enforcement day here in Washington, D.C. People from all over the country come to pay their respects to fallen officers. We have officers who die at the rate of maybe 200 a year versus 1,200 per year of people who die at the hands of officers. So until we get a handle on that situation, we will not have true reform. The second part of that through line is guns. Guns have been linked to kind of racial animus, that whenever you have white people who feel a threat of race, they will go get a gun. They listen to rhetoric about criminals running the streets. They listen to rhetoric about a black president who is going to take away those guns and leave them defenseless against the intruder in the night. They believe in the myth of the good guy with a gun against the bad guy with a gun. Now, we all kind of know that this is coded language for the racial animus that pervades the society, the very thing that Chuck Schumer was talking about. So on one end of the spectrum, we have over-policing by a government-funded agency that has power to kill people. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have people who are listening to fears and worries that this agency is not going to do enough to keep you and your family safe, therefore you need a gun. And the fact that the United States is awash with guns makes it that much more difficult for police to do their jobs, but somehow that never gets equated into the conversation when we talk about gun reform. So there's a lot of factors here, a lot of moving parts, all of which I think lead to some pessimism about whether or not this George Floyd bill will get passed that will enact police reform and uniformity and accountability that we all say we want.
Cheryl, you're a retired police sergeant. You spent 20 years on the force in Los Angeles, and you heard Joseph's story, you've heard Rashawn's story. I'm sure you have friends and family members who probably have similar stories, and you also know the police perspective. So give me your breakdown on things.
Well, yeah, I'm a mother of 4 sons, and so I have the same concerns that every mother has when my sons leave the house. I, too, have been racially profiled And it's not until they find out who I am that I'm dealt with in a very different way. And so I'm appreciative of the fact that now this administration has an attorney general that is going to look into these atrocities that have been occurring across the United States. And listen, Derek Chauvin is just one person that we know of on the Minneapolis Police Department, but I promise you, every police department has a few Derek Chauvins in their midst. We don't necessarily need a national registry. He was on a list somewhere. He had to have been with 22 personnel complaints. And so now it's time for action. No more talking about what needs to be done. It's a real simple fix. If police chiefs have an appetite to remove folks like Derek Chauvin from their ranks, then I think society will be all the better for it. And if you don't have the wherewithal to get them off the streets, at the very least, assign them to desk duty so that they can't do any harm. I think what also needs to happen is, and what was so different in this case, is that we saw police chiefs, commanders, lieutenants, and a patrol sergeant, all high-ranking officials within that department, basically brought in to court to speak to the training and how this violated everything that they expect of their officers. And I think if we do more of that going forward, it will be less likely for a defense attorney to say that something that we saw was within policy. When we hear from a police chief, no, that's not what we expect, and that's not what we train our officers to do.
Cheryl, you brought up the Attorney General, Merrick Garland. I'd like to play a little bit of what he had to say today and then get your reaction on the other side.
The challenges we face are deeply woven into our history. They did not arise today or last year. Building trust between community and law enforcement will take time and effort by all of us. But we undertake this task with determination and urgency, knowing that change cannot wait.
Cheryl, is change coming? And you brought this up, and I want to talk to you about it because you know all about it, this blue wall of silence where police officers kind of fall in line, and yet you talked about how we saw a number of them actually take the witness stand. Is the wall starting to crumble?
No, the wall's not crumbling. Listen, these aren't rank and file police officers. These are patrol cops coming and speaking, because many times the fear and concern is that you don't have the support of the watch commander, who usually has the rank of a lieutenant, or your area captain. You don't have their support, and you certainly don't want to be shunned by your peers, ribbed, hazed, or God forbid, not get the backup that you need because somehow you've fallen out of favor. But certainly having command staff come and speak credibly to the issues of training and what's expected of their officers is something that's going to be very difficult for a defense attorney to refute, as in the case of Derek Chauvin. And so while this is all a great first step, I think there needs to be more of this. And I know that they're going to be looking at supervision. We saw on the radio body cam worn by Chauvin how he lied initially about what was involved in that situation. And so I think they need to take a look at everything that this officer touched over his 19-year career, because how many other folks have been arrested by him? He put hands on them, and when an officer puts hands on you, you will go to jail for something. How many of those cases were district attorney rejects because of insufficient evidence? How many people are sitting in jail right now because Derek Chauvin lied on them in pursuit of punishment? And so this is a lot that still needs to be done over there on that department. And so DOJ, Attorney General, State Attorney Ellerson should look into all of that.
Talisa, one of those who spoke rather eloquently last night was the Vice President of the United States, the first black Vice President. Let's listen to what she had to say.
Here's the truth about racial injustice. It is not just a Black America problem or a people of color problem. It is a problem for every American. It is keeping us from fulfilling the promise of liberty and justice for all. And it is holding our nation back from realizing our full potential.
Can this be a case of racial reckoning for this country?
Racial reckoning is a large feat. And, you know, as the Vice President so eloquently, as you stated, put it, you know, we, as the United States, there's a vast array of perspectives, a vast array of backgrounds, so many people. And the core part her speech about whether or not this is holding us back, right? Racial injustice is holding us back from fulfilling this promise. But who made the promise in the first place? Who made that promise? When was it made? Was it made with the intent of everyone? Or have we interpreted it now differently? And can we really live up to those expectations? Even the Constitution, right? There's so many questions into how it was written and how it plays out in a society that has perhaps evolved past what the founding fathers even thought possible. So there's work to do. But is this case a moment of racial reckoning? I think that a lot of my colleagues on the panel would agree that there was a moment of relief, a moment of positivity, a moment of hope when many people who do this work are hesitant to do so at this time. So do I think it's a step towards racial reckoning? Absolutely. Is it a case for the country? That's a different question.
Rashawn, the Minnesota Attorney General referred to the people who were there that day as a bouquet of humanity, these people who documented what happened, the people who spoke up against the power at hand, tried to do something to save this man's life. And we know that the cell phone changed everything. And Joseph talked about this misleading account from the police. And yet it was this video produced by a 17-year-old that changed everything. And you have in your article, in the words of Will Smith, racism is not getting worse, it's just getting filmed. Talk to us about the power of that 9-minute video.
So I conducted extensive research on social media, in particular Twitter, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in Ferguson. We analyzed over 30 million tweets. And what we found is that social media is a way for people to circumvent traditional modes of communication. People can instantly upload information, and that video went viral. And I think that video helped to single-handedly catapult where we are today. That led to that slam dunk case in the conviction of Derek Chauvin. But look, make no mistake, as much as videos matter, they can't do it alone. And we need broad-scale, transformative policy change that deals with qualified immunity, that deals with creating police department insurance policies and individual liability insurance. And we also know that as much as we watch these videos, whether in person witnessing it or watching it repeatedly on the news and on social media, it has an impact on our health. Some of the other research I've done with some of my colleagues shows that women's physical health suffers, more likely to have diabetes, more likely to have high blood pressure. Men's mental health suffers, more likely to be diagnosed with depression and anxiety, because Black pain is traumatic, it is exhausting, and it is something that we continuously live in America. And for one of the first times, at least in recent history, white people, as well as people around the world, are being exposed to Black pain and the way that we lack our dignity when we interact with law enforcement.
Really good point. And I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us. A great discussion. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.